Chapter 5 The Riddle. Well, here is a mystery, a genuine one at last. One we can put our fingers on, and what's more, one that really concerns us. Rosanna exclaimed songfully, after she had got the Dryad safely to bed in the spare chamber, tipped the foaming eggnog down her throat, and finally left her on the verge of sleep with the shades drawn. The three Fays were collected in Rosanna's ship room, excited and speculative. It's not like your Hindu, Rosanna, went on elated, or like our hired boy either. Pat doesn't want us to solve the mystery of his appearance and personality, and the Hindu, if he was a Hindu, was never any of our business, anyway. But this girl needs our help, and is depending on us. Let's get down to business, and see what we can make of it. Rob was pacing the floor, his hands at his back. He stopped midway in the room now, and said, "But has it occurred to you, Rosanna, that Pat may be mixed up in this, both of them appearing like this, out of nowhere, both mysteries? They may come from the same place." Rosanna laughed softly. They were taking great pains to be quiet, not to disturb the girl, supposedly asleep 2 doors away. "Of course, Rob, it has occurred to me. Why wouldn't it? I tested her a little with it too. I said his name, sharply, Pat Donovan, while I was helping her undress. She hardly looked up. Apparently it meant nothing to her. But since Pat's name is probably an assumed one, I didn't stop there. I asked her whether she couldn't remember a brother, though heaven knows they don't look like brother and sister, but she couldn't." "I should say not," Claire exploded, almost forgetting to keep her voice hushed. "They don't act as though they belonged to the same race even, say nothing to the same family. What could Pat have to do with the Dryad, anyway? He's a mortal of the mortals, if there ever was one. It's all a mere accident, his looking like a young brother to Jupiter." Rosanna pushed her buttercup hair back of her ears and sat more erect on the window seat, looking very sensible and efficient. "Of course we have no proof that she isn't a Dryad," she stated in her most tolerant manner. Her clothes certainly almost looked it. They were cobwebby, such fine stuff that it thrilled me merely to fold them up. When I put them down on the chair after I'd folded them, I actually thought the breeze in the windows might blow them up and around the room like mist, you know. But even so, we'd better go on the assumption that the girl is a real girl, and that a distracted family are probably, at this instant, wildly searching for her." "But it's darned queer all the same," Rob muttered. "We know all the people within a radius of 10 miles of the Four Corners, and I suppose Violet and Bill know all the summer people for 20 miles, at least, by sight. Why wouldn't they have recognized her? And she didn't come from far. She couldn't have, in those clothes, and stay so sort of rain-washed, as you yourself noticed. Rosanna, so who is she? Where did she come from?" "The simple answer is, the only one left. She came from our woods, from Tanglewood, just as she herself says." Rosanna had thought all this for herself. Well, of course, there is Wing Gate, she admitted. She may belong there, be visiting or something. But that wasn't what Rob had meant. He had said woods, not Wingate. He thought Wingate itself was unlikely. When we got the mail this morning, Miss Ford didn't say anything about a visitor at Wingate. And she did tell us all over again about the 3 servants and Mr. and Mrs. Titus. She thinks it's ridiculous for a family of only 2 people to take such a huge house for the summer, and to expect 3 servants to run it. She said she had just asked the cook, who had come for mail a minute before us, if they were going to have house parties or anything this summer, and he said he was sure they weren't, or any company at all. Did we tell you he's a Jap? Oh no, Miss Ford would be on to it if any such girl as the Dryad had come to Wingate. But how can she belong anywhere else? Rosanna exclaimed impatiently. In those silver slippers, and those beautiful clothes, and her hair done so elaborately. There's not another summer place for miles. And she certainly didn't get off any train or out of a car like that. Certainly not. She got out of a tree like that, and she's been hiding and starving in our attic. That was Claire's contribution, said firmly and almost with belief on her part. It was a fact that the Dryad had taken the eggnog as though she were famished, so Claire had some reason to speak of her as starving. But for the rest, Rosanna felt that her younger sister was being annoyingly obstructive. I think it's a pretty serious business, she said, getting up from the window seat and beginning to straighten the articles on her dressing table. It's so serious that we need help. We'd better get hold of Dr. Bronnell on the telephone. He can drive over here and see the Dryad during the evening and decide whether we've got to get in touch with the police or what we'd better do. The police, Rob snorted. Mr. Ford, I suppose, our noble sheriff. A fat lot of help he'd be about anything. I don't know why you're so down on poor Mr. Ford, Rosanna protested. He had to put up those signs, didn't he? It wasn't his idea, you know. He didn't even know he was spoiling your playground. Imagine calling Tanglewood their playground. It was so much more and beyond that. But the nearest phone is at Wingate. It's been connected, I know. So you and Claire run over there and ask the use of it. And make certain before you get the doctor, of course, that this girl didn't come from there. I think you had better go right now. I'll stay in case she wakes up. At this precise instant, Hester appeared in the doorway, rather dour of face, and announced supper. Well, of course, it was supper time. The clock down in the hall was striking 6. They had totally forgotten that time was passing. We'll have supper before you go, Rosanna said, after an instant's hesitation. After all, if she does belong over there, it's their business to come here to look for her. We are the nearest family to Wingate, and the logical first place of search. I'm hungry as a tiger, in spite of all those cheese dreams. But halfway down the stairs, Rosanna held them back and whispered, One thing we've got to remember. The poor girl is morbidly sensitive about having lost her memory. When she finds it again, the fewer people who know she ever lost it, the better it will be for her peace of mind. So let's keep it from Pat. It's none of his affair anyway. I feel morally certain They've nothing to do with each other. But Hester, she'll have to know, Claire affirmed. I teased her, just for fun, when I was making the eggnog. She'd begun supper then, and I told her a Dryad had come out of the woods, and we were putting her to bed. She got quite worked up over the mystery of it. We'll explain everything to her now. Oh, of course, to Hester. She will keep mum. We can always trust her for that. But don't say a word at the table, or Pat will hear in the kitchen. Wait till he's out of the house. Claire was sorry that Pat was to be left out of the fun, and she remembered a little guiltily, but with no regret, that she had confided other affairs to him this afternoon, since he knew so much about the Hindu and the diamond bracelet, and the boy angel who had shut his eyes. It would be logical to share the Dryad with him too. What shall we tell him? She asked. Well, have to explain our visitor somehow. Not if you find this evening that she belongs at Wing Gate. They'll send for her in their limousine, and nobody need ever know she was here, except Violet and Bill, who will think she was invited, and that I was joking, saying I couldn't imagine who she was. But if she doesn't belong there, if we don't find out where she belongs, then I can tell him. Well, wait and see. Mum's the word now. Hester served them in unusual silence, the result of Claire's teasing. It was her habit to ignore etiquette entirely and join in with whatever conversation was forward at meals. But tonight her feelings were really hurt, because she felt that the Fays were keeping something from her, having secrets, and there was a rather grim set to her clean-cut New England face. The Fays understood her mood, and were bursting to take her into their secret, let her share the excitement, and wonder with them. But what could they do? There was the door into the kitchen ajar, behind its painted screen, and in that kitchen, eating his supper at the kitchen table, sat the hired boy, Pat, with a pair of perfectly good ears. So Hester rather stumped around the table, and set things down just a trifle more firmly than necessary. Nobody was going to make her believe that a Dryad, whatever that was, had come right out of Tanglewood, through that break in the wall there, famishing for an eggnog, and then had gone to sleep in the guest room. That there was somebody asleep in the guest room she was aware. The door was partly open, and she had just peeked before announcing supper. There was dark hair spread on a white pillow, and a pale cheek visible, but a perfect stranger, a Dryad. Hester had spent enough summers taking care of these Fays to have her powers of believing strange things stretched considerably, but hardly that considerably. So she cleared the table when the time came with unnecessary clatter and rush, and in passing around the dessert, Jello with lots of fruit and nuts, Claire's absolutely favorite dessert, not counting ice cream and plum pudding. She gave Claire a deliberately scrimped portion, and her annoyance and curiosity rose almost to the pitch of expression in words, but not quite, when the unexpected happened, and Claire ate in silence, taking no notice of the gross injustice. Claire and Rob were delighted to have a legitimate excuse to go into their enchanted woods, again in defiance of the signs. By taking that short cut, they would reach Wingate's front door almost as soon as though they went in Pegaway by the road. Rosanna followed them out through the kitchen to give final directions. Better be as tactful as you can when you ask those people whether the Dryad belongs there. If she doesn't, then they need never know the ins and outs of the business here. Just ask to use their telephone, if that's the way it is, and if you think they can hear you talking, simply tell Dr. Brunel that we need him over here rather urgently, but not for sickness. We can explain when he comes. Most of this was said out on the back porch, with Hester at the kitchen sink, taking it all in. Then the two younger Fays shot gaily away toward the wall and the woods behind it. Rosanna turned back into the kitchen. "Where's Pat, Hester?" she asked. "I'm sure I don't know, Miss Rosanna. I'm not his nurse, am I? He said he was going for a walk." Rosanna laughed. "Oh, don't be so cross," she exclaimed. "Now that boy's out of the way, I'll tell you all about everything, Hester. But it's something we are going to keep secret, just among ourselves, so we couldn't discuss it while you were waiting on table and Pat right here in the kitchen, could we?" Hester was at once mollified, to the point of handing Rosanna a dish towel so that she might speed up the drying of dishes while imparting her confidences. When Rosanna had given out all that they knew about the Dryad and the manner of her appearing, she added seriously, "Of course, Hester, we only call her a Dryad for fun. We don't really think she is one. What she is just a pitiful girl from nobody knows where who has suddenly lost her memory. When she comes to, and she may do that at any minute, it would be pretty embarrassing for her if the whole neighborhood knew what had happened to her. Don't you think so?" Hester agreed that the average person would certainly be a little diffident about such an experience as the Dryad's. "But suppose we don't find out who she is or where she comes from?" she asked after several china plates had gone, dripping and soap-suding, into the drainer for Rosanna's rinsing. "Why, that won't happen. We've just got to find out. A girl can't suddenly appear coming down our front stairs and never be identified or get explained." But Hester was not so cocksure. "I don't know," she mused aloud. "Strange things do happen, especially to those children." She meant Claire and Rob. "It's like as if those two sort of attract the wonderful. I don't know what that Janice girl means by saying nothing does ever happen at Lark's Nest, and we ain't in things. We're in more things this identical minute than she has it in her poor brains to dream of, say nothing to shake a stick at. Oh, Hester, where were you, listening to that teasing little speech? Or has Claire already confided it to you, perhaps when she was beating up the eggnog? It's like as if those children had a kind of magic around with 'em, in their pockets or somewhere, and it keeps going off like fireworks. It's been one thing after another ever since I knew them. Before that, my feet was on earth, pretty solid. I guess just like anybody's. But exactly and precisely what is a dryad anyway, Miss Rosanna? Well, that's easy at least. Easier than some things you've been asking me lately. Rosanna replied, A dryad is a sort of fairy who lives in a tree. In a way, she is the spirit of the tree. When the tree dies, she dies too, or goes away. Nobody knows for certain about that, I imagine. Claire says that our dryad upstairs came from a silver maple, but you aren't taking their nonsense seriously, are you? Hester had forgotten her work and was gazing at Rosanna dreamily, but at the smiling question her lips tightened into a firm straight line, and she returned to the dishes abruptly. Hester was a New England spinster who had worked out ever since she had finished with the district school at Four Corners. Her age was somewhere between 40 and 50, but she looked younger than 40, a good deal. If Uncle Sam shall ever become a married man, he will probably choose a replica of Hester, so tall, lanky, strong-minded, and downright. She wore print dresses and checked aprons, and when an errand took her out of doors in the summer, huge sunbonnets. Her hands were strong and capable, and no matter how grim her mouth ever became, her eyes remained calm. But during the few summers she had been working for the Fays, something indefinable had been added to all this, an expression of expectancy. Her friends and relatives at Four Corners and Crescent Lake did not notice the change, or anyway, if they did not mention it. But there was no doubt it was there. There was no doubt that right in the middle of her life, here where she had always lived, where she had begun to hope for nothing and to expect less, she had stumbled right onto that glamorous, perilous, and forever consoling ground, imagination, or Claire had pushed her out into that territory. Now, in reply to Rosanna's laughing warning, she responded, not taking it seriously, Why, I don't know, but maybe I am doin' just that. Who's to say, till we find out for sure and certain what the girl is. Before you got here this summer, 'twas back in the spring, I had that same thought about trees. I said to myself, there might be a kind of spirit residin' in a tree, like we reside in our bodies, only looser, you know, that comes and goes in the woods. It might be doin' that, or it might be leaning out from its tree body, some time as you go by, looking at you, only after your back is turned, if you know what I mean. Specially silver maples and birches, and maybe the poplars, though not so likely the poplars. I was a-goin' to tell Claire how I'd thought it, and now this has happened. One in Lark's Nest, perhaps. Asleep in the guest room. I shouldn't wonder. Rosanna was taken aback. She wanted sensible advice from Hester just now, and ideas. Claire and Rob have bewitched you with their nonsense, she exclaimed. It's lucky for you. I'll say that I'm here to hold you all down to earth. If I weren't, you might go puff up in the air like so many toy balloons, with your enchanted violets, enchanted tanglewood, enchanted wing gate, dark men in turbans, mysterious jewels, lost dryads, and Greek god hired boys. But don't you let them muddle you. Hester will have everything straightened out and explained very soon. Sensible explanations. All it needs is a few brains. Well, maybe. Hester did not sound convinced, though her face was a trifle darkened. It lightened, however, immediately as she amended, "I shouldn't wonder if you'll do all you say about hitting on some explanation or other for the Dryad and the rest. But it don't matter much. There'll always be something left over, just enough to keep us wondering, in spite of all the explanations in the world. I've noticed that." Rosanna smiled as she went away to take a look at the Dryad, because, after all, she had more sympathy with Hester's point of view than she cared to admit, and Hester continued with her spoken thoughts for some time after her auditor had departed, but softer now, under her breath. "I'd just like to tell that Janice, young thing, that she is makin' a mistake. Wonderful things don't happen to people who go prancing about all over the place, wildly hunting for 'em, the way that crowd behaves. Never. No more than happiness comes by grabbing for it and jumping after it, world on end. Amen. Claire and Rob are the quietest young folks I ever saw. They don't go snoopin' and lookin' and clutchin'. They stay still as still. Her sayin' Claire was an eavesdropper and ought to wear a bell just because she wasn't callin' everlastin' attention to herself and gigglin' herself silly. It is easy to see that by this time Hester had entirely forgiven Claire her recent teasing. "I'm a-goin' to put a dish of that fruit nut jello in her room where she'll see it before she goes to bed," she muttered as she finally draped her snowy dishcloth on the pegs above the sink and hung the shining dishpan behind the stove. And that is the last thing she did half an hour later, before she retired to her own very early repose, to sleep the sleep of hard work and a good conscience. Meanwhile, Claire and Rob had got through the woods, and by circuitous route, keeping out of sight of the windows of the house, come around onto the fern and weed-grown driveway sweeping up to Wingate's porticoed front door. Chapter 6. More bewilderment. It was still broad daylight on the drive, but in under the portico it was dim and twilightish. Rob and Claire were conscious of a sense of gloom and unfriendliness as they stood in front of the big door, whose knocker had not yet been polished, although the Tituses had been occupying the house for 2 weeks now, and those ferns and weeds in the drive. Claire and Rob had always liked them growing there, untouched in the deserted days of Wingate. But when a house is occupied, somehow it is more suitable, more altogether cheerful, to rake up the drive. The bell was of the old-fashioned variety, a knob that you pull. Rob worked it vigorously twice, and then, after some waiting, again, even harder. Either the bell cord's broken, he announced, or else the door's too thick for us to hear the ringing. I certainly didn't hear anything. Did you, Claire? He did not turn to discover why she did not answer, but lifted the knocker instead and let it clap down on the oak paneling. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Then he stood back and waited. It was at this instant that a stirring of the violet curtains screening a narrow window at the side of the door caught their attention. The curtains were parting softly, and a face looked out. It was their Hindu. He was wearing his white turban, and his eyes, even in the twilight, were piercing. But almost before they had time to realize that he was there, he was gone. The violet curtains closed mysteriously, and the great front door swung slowly open, almost as mysteriously. A manservant, answering in every particular Miss Ford's description of the Wingate butler, stood there correctly, stiff as wood, the only mobile thing about him his eyebrows, which were slightly questioning. This was Mr. Oliver Sharp, an Englishman, whose entire correspondence for the past 2 weeks, up until this morning, anyway, consisted of one picture postal card from a lady in New York who signed herself Lydia Marsh and mentioned a good time they had enjoyed in company at Coney Island. It was difficult for Claire to imagine this wooden figure disporting himself at Coney Island at any time or in any company, but her faith in Miss Ford's information was not shaken. You can't always tell from appearances in this world. Rob was asking for Mr. Titus. He's at dinner. May we come in and wait, then until he is at liberty? Mr. Oliver Sharp hesitated a second, but finally gave his consent by drawing back and a little to one side. He motioned them to 2 high-backed chairs against the wall, just inside the door, and silently they took them. Then he withdrew, whether to acquaint Mr. Titus with the fact that he had callers waiting, or simply out of indifference to them, they did not fathom. The minute he had turned the corner of a door some distance down the hall, Rob exclaimed, "Queer owl, isn't he? It must be Mr. Oliver Sharp. S'pose he's engaged to Lydia." "Shh!" ever so softly came from Claire, and she made a quick sign to Rob not to talk. She added with her lips, but inaudibly, "We are being watched." How could she doubt it? The instant they had been admitted to the hall, she had looked for the long high window of the violet curtain. She did not find the window, but there was a recess let into the wall precisely where she had expected to see the window, and longer violet curtains hung from a pole to cut it off from the hall proper. Behind that curtain was that window, and at that window she had seen the Hindu. He was certainly there still, for if he had come out of the alcove, he must, of necessity, have passed the open front door, and then they would have seen him, while Oliver Sharp was hesitating over allowing their entrance. Rob could read Claire's lips easily enough, for it was an old game with them, and he pulled himself together sharply. With his own lips, but soundlessly, He begged for more of this fascinating information. Claire said, "Hindu behind that curtain. Don't look now." And Rob justified her trust in his self-control by not looking or turning his head. Claire folded her hands, and they sat thus in perfect silence for a quarter of an hour, according to the queer clock encased in a glass globe, which they could see up at the turn of the stair. But if their tongues were idle, their eyes were busy, and their hearts too. Claire's heart was beating strangely, with little skips and jumps of pure feeling. It was exciting that they were being watched by their mysterious Hindu, his eyes somewhere in the folds of the heavy violet curtain a few feet away. But it was even more exciting, and rather painfully so, to be sitting within a few steps of their enchanted drawing-room. It was already lighted, although the dusk had hardly begun to fall, and Claire could just distinguish their boy angel balancing on his cloud in the gloom above the blur of light cast by the shaded lamps. She could not see whether his eyes were open or not. The edge of one of their tapestries was visible, the one of the doe's head, and several dear, familiar objects, pulled about into unfamiliar situations. If Claire should get up and walk into the room, and go right up to the tapestry, she would find out once and for all, and forever whether that bit was a doe's head, or the tip of a knight's helmet, and what the whole picture was about. She and Rob were feeling exactly the same way about that drawing-room. They hoped devoutly that when Mr. Titus did finish his dinner and come out, he would not invite them in there. It was sad enough to have their enchanted room pulled about and the boy angel disturbed without themselves taking part in it. Hester had been right about Claire's and Rob's ability to be still. They were proving it now. They sat erectly, lightly, even their eyes stilled, thinking their thoughts, and not too impatient about time passing. Claire did have to smile to herself now and then, wondering what the hidden Hindu was making of their silence. Suddenly there came the opening of a door, and steps, but no voices. A woman was walking toward them up the hall, from the dining room, supposedly. She was young, at least youngish, tall, blonde, slim, and beautifully dressed in a black chiffon dinner gown. There were jewels in her hair, about her throat, and on her arms. Claire and Rob came to their feet, waiting. She stopped short when she noticed them there in the darkening hall, and rather gasped. Sharply she turned her head. "Harry," she exclaimed. "Sharp has let those children in. They're here." Mr. Titus was close at her shoulder. He had not dressed for dinner, but was in tennis flannels, his shirt open in a V at the neck, but for all the unconventionality of his attire, he looked rather distinguished, interesting. He was taller than his wife, lean, with steel-gray eyes and a firm, thin-lipped mouth. He gave one glance at his callers and called, "Sharp," in a voice remarkable for angry nervousness. Then the butler came forward from some retreat. Mr. Titus questioned him swiftly. "Why did you let these people in? Have they been here alone, in the hall, all the time you were serving us. It's inexcusable. You had my orders. Nobody inside the door. I didn't understand your orders to exclude children, sir, and I thought I told you they were waiting. Yes, but out of doors. Out of doors, I supposed, naturally. And I'd like to know what your definition is of children, Sharp. Mr. Titus, with the last words, eyed Rob up and down with swift appraisal of his strong, straight, 5'9", his dignified and quiet bearing. Children. It was an odd reception for two perfectly inoffensive young people calling at a neighbor's house on a simple errand. Rob was nonplussed, in spite of his assumed quiet and his steady gaze. His first words showed his confusion. "Sorry to bother you, sir," he spoke abruptly, "but there's a girl." Suddenly remembering Rosanna's careful directions not to give information about the Dryad, unless she really belonged here, he changed his opening. "Have you any visitors by chance? Any girl staying here? Or were you expecting a girl?" Both the Tituses stared. Mr. Titus answered, "We have no visitors. We have not had any visitors. We are not expecting any visitors. And we don't want any visitors. But may I ask what business that is of yours, my young friends?" Rob got very red. Claire was cool. She was remembering the Hindu behind the curtain, wondering whether the Tituses knew he was there, and wondering why Mr. Titus's hand, the one he had just removed from his pocket, should be shaking so. Was it nerves or anger? "Well, well, it is our business in a way. Rosanna, she's our sister, and we are your neighbors. Mr. Titus, we live at Lark's Nest, just beyond your wall. Well, Rosanna wanted us to find out, before we telephoned into Crescent Lake. We haven't a telephone, you see, and we came to ask to use yours, if you don't mind." "Oh, is that all?" It was Miss Titus's exclamation, and somehow it sounded full of relief and almost goodwill, but she was running her eyes over Claire and Rob in an ill-bred sort of way. At least Claire couldn't imagine her mother looking at anybody on earth like that. She became acutely conscious of her mussed curls, her dirty stockings, and the red she felt coming and going in her face. "It's only the telephone they want, Harry. They might have told Sharp." "Well, use it if you like then, and don't be long. I want to put in a long-distance call myself shortly." The woman was waving them impatiently toward the violet curtain, the curtain behind which the Hindu was concealed. Suddenly Claire was frightened. Was it a trick? Did they mean some harm to come to Rob? Was there really a telephone behind that curtain? There was something weird and uncertain in the atmosphere here, and what strange, unfriendly people. "Rob," Claire cried, "remember!" But it was too late. He had taken the few steps necessary and yanked the curtain along its rod. The alcove was exposed. It was, as Miss Titus had indicated, a telephone booth, with a table on which stood the instrument, and a chair so that one might sit while one talked. And there was the high, violet-curtained window. But Claire and Rob did not at the instant take in these things. They were staring at the Hindu. He stood plastered against the wall at the left of the window, amazingly tall in his high headgear, his dark face inscrutable. Miss Titus gasped audibly, but the Hindu retained his impressive calm. Slowly, with great dignity, and what appeared to be a natural hauteur, he came forward, descended the steps into the hall, and without a glance or a word to anyone present, passed to the staircase, and slowly moved away up the wide flight, not touching the banister. There was something distinctly uncanny in the utter silence with which that tall white figure moved beyond their vision, into the gloom of the upper regions. "Well," Rob exclaimed, looking almost joyfully at Claire, his hand still on the curtain. Mr. and Mrs. Titus had stood from the instant of the exposure of the listener to his disappearance, silent, with heads a little bowed and hands tensed. But now Mr. Titus jerked himself up, in a low voice, with a cautious glance toward the stairs' gloom. He growled, you young nuisances. Now he's offended. I hadn't an idea he was in there. How'd he expect us to know? Go home you." Miss Titus, however, was more in control of her emotions. She spoke with strained but honeyed sweetness, her hand thrust out to Mr. Titus's arm, soothingly. "My husband means go after you have telephoned," she explained, "and please do hurry, because I am about to use the thing myself." "Oh no, we won't bother you any more," Rob said with an access of native dignity. "Come on, Claire. We made a mistake in coming here at all." Nobody protested that statement, and their exit through the front door was accomplished without protest from the Tituses. Outside, they were too incensed to bother about their circuitous route for avoidance of the windows. Boldly they hurried around the house, across the drawing-room terrace, and plunged into the woods. "Sweet people," Rob was muttering. "Darling neighbors, enchanting." But Claire grabbed at him. "Rob, there's someone coming," she whispered, standing stock still and freezing. Rob froze too. Claire was right. A figure, a boy, was blundering through the trees in their direction, stumbling over roots as he came, crackling the underbrush, and making all kinds of a racket in the otherwise silent woods. A lilac bush, during the years of Wingate's neglect, had either straggled of itself out into the woods, or else had been overtaken by them. It didn't matter which. What concerned Claire and Rob was that it provided a thick screen for themselves now, and they quickly backed into it. "It's Pat," Claire gasped. "Nobody else." The figure came on, with 1,000 unnecessary noises, until even Rob could be certain that it was indeed their hired boy. He passed near enough to their lilac bush for them to have reached out and touched him, but he remained totally unaware of their presence. That showed how little he knew woods, or was at home in them. He ought to have sensed living, breathing people so near at hand as that. Anyone could see that he was making a great effort to be secretive, in spite of his racket, and utterly failing. Without asking themselves why, Claire and Rob stole from their bush and trailed him back to Wing Gate. They paused at the edge of the woods, however, and waited while he went on. Just beyond the back door lattice, there was a window in the cellar wall, and Pat went directly there, popped down on his knees, and began fumbling with the pane. He was in absolutely plain view from the kitchen windows, but nobody noticed him apparently. Rob and Claire were breathless. What was the boy doing? What he was doing was housebreaking and entering. For all in an instant, he had got the window open and disappeared down through it, feet first, into the cellar. Well, here's one mystery solving itself. Before our eyes, I'll say, Rob muttered aloud. Pat's a thief, a housebreaker anyway. They were crouching in the shadow at the edge of the woods, but now Claire stood up, precipitately. You are utterly mean and disgusting to talk like that, she affirmed. You're beastly. I don't know what's the matter with you, Rob declared, honestly bewildered. I'm not beastly at all. I'm interested, aren't you? What do you make of it? Claire plunked down on her knees again, close beside him, bracing the palms of her hands in the moss. I make this of it, or I will if you don't look out, she whispered desperately. I begin to think the Dryad is only pretending to have lost her memory. How do we know she isn't? All that stuff about not knowing who she is may be her way of getting into Lark's nest to rob us. Perhaps what happened is that she went upstairs to steal Rosanna's silver toilet set and got caught coming down. So she made up all that story. She must be clever. Don't be idiotic, Claire. What's all that got to do with our hired boy's exploit here? The Dryad didn't have the silver toilet set with her when we saw her on the stairs, did she? You're nutty. Rob could be as insulting and angry as Claire. No, she didn't have it with her. Perhaps she isn't exactly an ordinary thief, Claire admitted, that much reasoning, but she added in the next breath, this may be it. She's in league with the Hindu in some way. For some reason, he is our enemy, and he has sent her to Lark's nest as a sort of spy, or something, or... Rob didn't let her go on. You're off your head, he exclaimed. The Dryad. She's a fine girl. I like her tremendously. But what's she got to do with what we are to think of Pat? Go on and elucidate. I don't get it. Not a bit. It's got this to do with it, Claire explained, more sanely, but just as firmly. You like the Dryad tremendously. You like her better already than you've ever liked Violet Janice and all that card-playing, jazzing bunch. Well, I feel exactly the same way about Pat. I do. He seems like a prince in disguise to me. Or, if he isn't, anything precisely so grand as that. He's anyway, I'm sure of it, one of those. One of those. That was Claire's and Rob's designation for certain very select persons. Persons who came up to an undefined and almost mystical standard. Persons they would not mind having around all the time. Their own, their very own comrades in things that mattered. So far, they had discovered comparatively few of these delectable persons. There was a certain young chemistry teacher in Rob's prep school. There was a policeman named Mike Collins, whom they had met in the Fenway this spring, shared a deep and thrilling adventure with, and been of as much assistance to as he to them in a certain strange hour. There was their own Airedale, Caesar, the dog they had brought up from infancy, and who, alas, was in a dog hospital in Boston, now recovering from his part in the policeman adventure. There was Hester. It had taken years to recognize Hester as authentically one of those. Lately, however, and all doubts as to her status had absolutely melted. And last and forever best of all, there was Granny, but she was dead, and now here was Claire, affirming that Pat himself was one of those. When before had they ever come to so momentous a conclusion so quickly, and with so little to go on? Rob looked at his sister through the twilight doubtfully. It was a solemn moment. Then he said, quite subdued, "Anyway, Claire, we'll have to wait for him, don't you think? When he comes out, we can just, in a friendly sort of way, ask him what he's been up to. That can't hurt, can it?" A noise suddenly transferred their attention from each other to the back door of Wing Gate. The Japanese cook, who was bottle washer as well, it appeared, had come out onto the steps and was carrying a small basket of rinsed tea towels down them, to disappear at the foot behind the lattice there. Suppose Pat should choose this time for his reappearance. Through that cellar window, he might be caught, just like that. The hearts of the watchers from the shadows were stilled with suspense. They heard the Jap moving about behind the lattice, rattling clothespins and humming a weird disharmony to himself. Meanwhile, somebody had turned on the lights in the kitchen, and they glared down onto the ground in the space before that cellar window. Would the Jap notice the open pane as he returned up the steps to the kitchen? How could he help doing so unless he was blind? And then, while the cook still busied himself with song and clothespins and tea towels, behind the lattice, Pat made his reappearance. First his head came up slowly and cautiously. Then he thrust forward an arm, and clutching his fingers into the ground, pulled. A few tugs, and he was entirely out and on his feet. Without waiting to close the pane, and with a somewhat anxious look all about, he started off in the direction of the woods, and the watchers there in the shadows, bent almost double, as though that posture might in some magical way make him invisible. He reached the trees only a few yards from the spot where Claire and Rob crouched, waiting the outcome of his mysterious adventure, but he was so preoccupied with the task of putting himself as soon as possible out of sight of the back windows and door of Wing Gate that he failed to notice them there in plain sight. They let him go by, and then rose to follow him with more artful caution than his own, so silently, in fact, that he was not at all aware of being pursued through the darkening woods. When pursued and pursuers had reached a distance well out of earshot from Wing Gate, Rob called to Pat. He stopped and whirled about and stood straight and defiant while they came up. They felt that he was surprised, but in no way afraid. Rob murmured something or other, but it was Claire who said quickly, in a merely conversational tone, as she could manage, "Hello there, Pat. Let's all walk home together. Can you see us? It's Rob and Claire." Chapter 7. The Prowler. Oddly, it was Pat, rather than themselves, who became inquisitor. "Whatever are you doing here?" he asked, in the tone of one with some rights to know. That freed Rob from the awe which had descended on him since Claire had claimed Pat for one of those. "What we are doing isn't half so interesting as what you've been doing," he answered. "Anyway, we haven't been housebreaking." "Housebreaking? I'm taking a walk." "Yes, in and out of cellar windows. A queer sort of walk." "What's the book?" Claire's heart gave a miserable thump. She could, in all truth, just distinguish the outlines of a book cherished under one of Pat's arms, and when he had broken into Wingate's cellar, he had been empty-handed. He kept his grand manner in spite of the accusation in Rob's tone. "It's all right. It's my own book," he replied shortly. "But you didn't have it half an hour ago when you came through the woods. We saw you going into that window, you know, and coming out." Now at last Pat was a trifle disconcerted, and for the minute he lost his air of princely assurance. "Well, anyway, the book's my own now," he decided to explain. "They'd thrown it away on an ash heap down there." Rob repeated his first inquiry, which really interested him. "What is the book?" he asked curiously. "What's its title?" And then he added, "Or is that a mystery too?" "No, not at all. It's the Iliad. Homer wrote it, a Greek." Rob laughed, and Claire shivered at the scorn in the laugh. "Sure, the Iliad's by Homer," he said. "We've heard that somewhere before tonight. But how'd you find out so much about the book, down there in the dark?" "We didn't notice you reading as you made your escape from the window or ran through the woods, bent half double, like a thief in a movie, registering fear of the police." Claire could not abide this. She gave Rob a look, unpleasant enough, she hoped, to penetrate even the darkness that had overtaken them, and started off toward home, exclaiming, "Rosanna's waiting all this time for our news." "Oh, all right." Rob came after her, leaving Pat standing to think over his insulting words. But Claire whirled around and waited for Pat, ignoring Rob, and when he came on, walked along with him. He was no match for her in finding his way along the dark trail, however, and after a minute, rather shyly but with decision, she reached out and took his hand. He let her keep it, almost as if he were grateful for its guidance. Now she was calm, no longer angry with Rob, and she supposed that her feeling of protective tenderness was the sort of happiness that Rosanna experienced all day and every day, the strength of motherliness. But when they finally got through the woods and came out at the wall, it was Pat who was first up and reached down a hand to her. She liked being helped as well as helping, and she admired Pat's wall-scaling ability and his strength. Rob was waiting for them at the foot of the ladder leading up to Pat's loft bedroom. "You mightn't everlastingly regret it," he promised. "If you confided in us, we might even be of some help to you, for if you aren't a housebreaker, and all that, and Claire and I both know you aren't, then you are in some scrape or other and need friends. Why don't you take us on?" Whatever effect this speech had on Pat, it gave Claire back her brother, but Pat shook his head. "I can't tell you any more than I have," he affirmed, "but I repeat, I am no thief." So the reunited brother and sister had to leave it at that and go to find Rosanna. She was more than impatient over the unconscionable time their so simple errand had taken, and bursting with eagerness to hear all. But when they had told her all, she said it was quite enough. What was that Hindu doing, behaving in such a sneaky way? She was as stirred and curious as they themselves had been over his mysterious reappearance. And why were the Tituses so openly suspicious and unfriendly? But even more important, what had Pat been up to? It was too utterly preposterous, the whole adventure. "Well, I see it's my turn now," she declared. "I'll get out, Pegaway, drive over to Four Corners, and telephone Dr. Brunell. You were right. I'm not using the Wingate phone when they were so unpleasant about it. Rob, you'd better come along. Claire, you stay and listen for the Dryad if she wakes. If she does, and has her memory back, or even if she wakes up and is still in her daze, you may be of some comfort to her. I've left the light burning in the hall upstairs. Hester's gone to bed an hour ago, and I've got to stay here just all alone. Oh, please, Rosanna." "What's the matter with that? You aren't afraid of anything, are you?" Well, of course, she wasn't afraid, not a bit. It was just that this day had held so much excitement that somehow she couldn't imagine its not going on. How was she to sit down in the parlor, tamely, with a book now, and wait the hour or more they would be gone? She was not a bit resigned, but she finally acquiesced. Pegaway did make clatter and racket enough as he galloped out of the barn to wake the dead, say nothing of the poor Dryad, Claire thought. His eyes lit up the night as he came, and every buttercup and devil's paintbrush that met his glance stood out with a vividness never attained by day. Claire thought she heard Rosanna call a final goodbye, or perhaps it was only instructions, as they bounded into the lane. And then suddenly there was only the night, soft and still and luminous with starlight. No need to go in. Claire would hear the Dryad if she called over so softly in this still evening. She would hear her as far as the apple orchard. She was sure enough of it to cross the lawn and get up into her favorite tree. There she braced her back against the trunk, swung her feet, and felt herself in a good situation to sort out the day in a little retrospect. By starlight she could just distinguish the break in the wall where the Dryad had come through. She would hardly have been surprised now if the Dryad should come flitting out of Lark's nest, screen door, and make for the break in the wall on a return to her tree in Tanglewood. For if she had been waked by Pegaway's departure, and remembered who she was on waking, how disconcerted she would be to find herself in bed in a guest room, in a house built for mortals. If that did happen, and the screen door should open, and the Dryad come out, Clare would follow her, run lightly through the dew-drenched grass, overtake her, fling her arms around her, kiss her pearly cheek, and whisper, "Goodbye forever. I'll never tell anybody, not even your woods, how you forgot what you were, and had the humiliation of wearing a hem-stitched muslin nightgown, and sleeping between sheets on a hair mattress. Trust this mortal never, never, never to give you away." How grateful the Dryad would be then! What would she say to her in return? Promise her for her silence? Perhaps she would offer a rendezvous in the woods some time, next year, when the signs were down, and say that Clare must come by herself secretly, not telling even Rob. This was the merest daydreaming, and a delicious way of spending the time until Rosanna and Rob got back. Better than reading, in Clare's present indolent mood. But it ended abruptly, and she returned to earth with a thump. Or perhaps it was only her excitable heart that had thumped so. Anyway, she had seen something quite unexpected, something far outside anything she had been daydreaming about. The something was coming through the gap in the wall. It was coming out into the meadows. It was coming toward Lark's nest. It could not be a person, for it was taller than any person. To Clare's wide, startled eyes, its height seemed nearer that of a tree. From head to foot, it was dead white. Could it be a white birch walking? There was nothing in Clare's philosophy to make her consider this an impossibility. If the Dryad had forgotten her tree, perhaps the tree had not forgotten its Dryad. But as it came gradually nearer, she could see that it was not tall enough for a tree after all. Yet it could never be a person. Its height still remained too great for that to be a possibility. Halfway across the meadow it paused for a full minute, while Clare got more and more excited about its height, which was truly uncanny. And then, right before her eyes, something that even she would have considered impossible happened. The thing suddenly went short. Now it was about the height of a very tall man. Something else was to follow. Up until this minute, the living, moving thing, whatever it was, had been white. Now, after it had gone short, it suddenly went black, and almost in the same instant that it went from white to black, it started moving again. It came on more swiftly, now toward Lark's nest. If Rob were only here, what an adventure this would be! But Rob was not here. Worse luck. And the three other people who might have given Clare some feeling of companionship were probably fast asleep. She made a quick note that Pat's light was out, so alone in the apple tree, and supposed to be guarding the house and the Dryad. Clare began not to enjoy herself so much. The tree she was in was her favorite tree in all the orchard. That was because, for a long time, she had almost unconsciously identified it with Granny. She had done this even before Granny died. It was the littlest and most gnarled of them all, but its blossoms were always the pinkest and the most thrillingly odorous, and its branches always the friendliest of any apple tree in all the world. Now Claire whispered, "Granny, Granny," and pressed back upon the boughs, hardly realizing that her lips had moved. Did arms come around her? Claire almost thought so, and anyway she was not afraid now, not what could be called really and truly afraid, that is. She began to think that the oncoming figure must be a human being, a very tall man, likely. He kept moving, skirted the orchard, not far from Claire in her tree, and made his way up close to the house. He began now to go more cautiously. She saw him outlined against the lighted parlor window, standing a little way back from it, obviously looking in. If he should go toward the door or touch the screen to open it, then Claire would have to act, do something about it. The first thing would be to scream, she imagined. That would wake Pat, and he would come to help her. But the scream was not necessary yet. The figure moved away from the window, went around by the back of the house, and after a minute emerged, going up toward the barn. Claire tore herself from the arms of her tree and cautiously crept to a better point, foreseeing what was going to happen next. The figure paused at the foot of the ladder, looked around for an instant, and began climbing. Claire was horrified. Was he going to murder Pat in his sleep? She dragged her reluctant feet as far as the clothes reel, and stood there on the verge of letting her scream take its part in this starlit drama. What kept her from it, she hardly knew, because certainly it would be the only sensible thing to do. You can't let a tall dark creature that a few minutes ago was a taller white creature go into a sleeping friend's chamber unannounced by your scream, not if you have any lungs at your service at all. However, Claire was glad of her hesitation when, after leaning forward at the top of the ladder and peering in at the open loft door for some seconds, the creature began backing slowly down the ladder again. Claire retreated into the shadow of the house and waited for further developments. Now the creature turned in her direction and bore down upon her. Oh, this was some nightmare. She must be asleep. She really must. She longed to wake up. She struggled to wake up, for she really thought it a dream now, but she kept her control. She did not move. She scarcely breathed. She attracted no unnecessary attention to herself whatever. And then the person, the thing, the creature swerved off and returned in the direction from which it had come. It crossed the meadow and passed through the break in the wall, into the black woods beyond. But Claire did not stir or sigh with relief. She waited in utter stillness for 3 minutes or more, her eyes glued to that break in the wall. Was the creature really done with Lark's Nest for tonight? Had they all escaped? And in the name of imagination, from what had they escaped? After a while, strung up with the experience, she went around to sit on the front doorstep and wait with almost unbearable impatience for the return of her brother and sister. But Pegaway's eyes were not the first to turn themselves glaringly up the lane. It was a bigger, heavier car, and it was grinding up in noisy second speed, sounding its silvery but penetrating horn at something, probably the hop toads, Claire surmised, since what else could possibly be in the path of its progress? Oh dear, why did big cars let themselves come up into Lark's Nest, own Precious Lane, when it was all the while much safer and almost as convenient to park them down on the state highway? There was no adequate place for them to get themselves turned around up here, not without crushing down the grass and striking out the life of whole communities of wild flowers. Pegaway was another affair altogether, of course. Nobody blamed him for anything when he came galloping out of the barn, one of his 3 masters at the wheel, kicking up his heels, and running so lightly, and with such knowledge of the growing things over which he must pass, that he avoided any real damage. The headlights of this car had picked out Claire on her doorstep before it was halfway up the lane. She lifted her arms to ward off the blaze of them, but the next instant, when she heard the wheels clench the earth and come to a stop at the foot of the flagged walk, she dropped her arms and found the dragon eyes still eating her own sight up. Then they went dead. Where were the stars? How could it be the same night when it was now so suddenly black? Then somebody giggled. Never in her life had Claire expected to be grateful for Violet Janice's rather insipid giggle, but now she was utterly grateful. "Oh, Violet," she cried joyfully, "is that really you?" "I'll say so, Claire, my dear," the so welcome voice sang back, and Claire utterly failed to notice the teasing quality of the "my dear." "What are you doing there, sitting like a goblin, guarding your cave, all legs and arms? Where's big sister and big brother?" "Here I am." Claire had plunged down the walk through the velvet dark, and now found Violet's hand. "Rosanna and Rob are away, but I'm awfully glad you've come. You'll stay, won't you?" Claire was surprised at the shake in her own voice, and even more surprised at the shake in her knees. But Violet's surprise was all for the warmth of Claire's welcome. She laughed banteringly and exclaimed, "That's a new gag, isn't it, sister? You're being so delighted to see me. You aren't rehearsing a play or something, are you? Are you going to faint with joy over Bill, too? He's here asleep at the wheel." A dark bulk murmured, stretched, and got down out of the car. Violet continued, "We're not here precisely for your entertainment, sister, if you don't mind my saying so. We've come to get big sister and brother to go to Four Corners, to a hick dance that's being staged at the Hill Farm tonight. They gave us the word and told us to come and bring anybody we liked. When they brought the milk, think it'll pay us to wait, and isn't it rather past your bedtime, duck?" Claire, although now she was hearing and recognizing Violet's accustomed inimical attitude to herself, ignored it, for it was her strong desire, unless taken by surprise, as she had been this afternoon, never to let this would-be pal of Rob's realize that his younger sister had any sensibilities whatever. She turned cool and elusive now, in her very best manner of avoiding intimacies. "I'm almost sorry, after all," she said, "that you bothered to turn up here, for Rosanna and Rob are out." "So, you have already told us. The point, though, is, when will they be in? They can't be out for much or for long. That's one thing sure. In this cemetery, such a dead place. How do they stick it?" Without any response to that, Claire led the way up to the screen door and into the parlor. After she had turned up the wick of the lamp on the table there, she murmured almost unintelligibly, "Make yourselves at home." But Violet was not to be silenced. She pursued the subject, which apparently had attained an almost morbid fascination for her. Sinking slinkingly into the corner of the sofa, the Dryad's corner, she pushed back her gold evening wrap, patted her hair into the contours she desired for it, and insisted, "But how do they stick it, and even seem to like it?"